Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast by Bruegel, the Brussels-based think tank, economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, Head of Outreach and Governance here at Bruegel.
And I'm Guntram Wolf, I'm the Director of Bruegel.
And we are pleased to welcome you in the first episode of The Sound of Economics Live. What makes this new series exciting is that we are live streaming the recording and we host an audience here in the room that will participate to the conversation. And for this first live session, we are happy to host in the studio Anu Bradford. Anu is Professor of Law and International Organization at Columbia Law School. And she's also a Director for the European Legal Studies Center over there. Hi, Anu, how are you?
Good, thank you for having me here.
And remotely connected from Princeton University, we have Ashoka Modi, Professor in International Economic Policy at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Hello, Ashoka.
Yes, thank you. Thank you also for having me, yes.
And we are here to discuss something I have been asking myself for a while now. What if Europe was shaping the world economy and most people didn't notice? What if the decisions that drove globalization were not made in televised meetings between world leaders at Davos, but quietly by technical compliance officers in anonymous corporate offices buildings? What if American protectionist bluster and China's steely nationalist defiance were largely a sideshow? In other words, is Europe a superpower? Before turning to our distinguished guests, I would like to ask the opinion of the audience. Can you raise hands if you think that Europe is a superpower?
Come on.
Well, okay, so for
Yeah,
our
Brussels.
listeners who cannot visualize the score rate, well, the room is quite split, I would say, rather split on the side that Europe is not a superpower, rather than Europe is a superpower, which gives me a very good opportunity to ask Anu, because you've been exploring this question at length and even provided a definition for it. You call it the Brussels effect, which, by the way, is also the title of the book that you have just released. So why do you think Europe rules the world, and what is the Brussels effect?
Yeah, great. So my first question is to ask you to poll the audience in the end as well, so I can see whether I've convinced the rest of the room as well.
We are going to do so.
So what do I mean by the Brussels effect? So the Brussels effect refers to the European Union's unilateral power to regulate the global markets. So it is a power that manifests through the rules and regulations that emanate from this city, from the buildings of the Commission and the Council and the Parliament. And that gives EU the unique ability to influence the world in a way that affects citizens and corporations around the world every day. So the rules coming from the EU, they determine the food we eat, the air we breathe, and the products we produce and consume. So if you think about, for instance, the big American technology companies, take Microsoft, Apple, Google, Facebook, they follow the European privacy rules globally. If you think about then how companies like Twitter and YouTube and against Facebook decide what kind of speech they take down when they govern their platforms, they follow a European definition of hate speech, not American constitution that would give right to much broader definition of speech that is allowed. And it's not just something that affects American companies. The EU laws determine how timber is harvested in Indonesia, how honey is produced in Brazil, what kind of chemicals Japanese toy manufacturers include in their toys, what kind of facilities Chinese dairy factories put into those factories, and how much privacy we afford to internet users in Latin America. So it is really the kind of power that shapes us in a very tangible ways every day. And that makes EU very special, and that, I would say, makes EU very powerful.
So just to understand, I mean, how strong is this effect really? I mean, I can see there are some examples, but then we also know that Chinese companies and the Chinese state shapes the way Africa looks at data privacy, and the Americans also shape the way. I mean, is Europe any special here, or is it just like any other bigger place?
Right. So we don't really see Washington effect. We don't really speak about Beijing effect. And that is not to say that China is without power or America wouldn't have power. There are many ways to exert power and leverage. So for instance, European Union is not in a position to use financial sanctions the way United States is. There is the Belt and Road Initiative that has given the Chinese inroads to influence policies in many parts of Africa and beyond. So the book does not make the case that the Brussels effect encapsulates the entire economy and gives EU unconstrained leverage or absolves the EU from the responsibility to build the powers where it doesn't have them. But the power that the EU has is significant, especially because it is something that the EU does not need to do much work to project. EU does not need to coerce anyone. EU does not need to elicit cooperation from other governments. All EU needs to do is to regulate the single market. An EU market is a large consumer market consisting of very affluent consumers. There are very few global companies that are in a position not to trade in the EU. And what these companies do, they follow the EU rules as the price for entering and competing on that market and serving the affluent European consumers. But often, and this is where it is the core of the Brussels effect, these companies conclude that it is in their interest to apply the EU standard globally. Instead of complying with multiple different compliance regimes, they don't set up a second production line to serve the other markets. Instead, there are scale economies and other benefits of uniform production that give the companies the business incentive to follow the most stringent standard globally. And that most stringent standard is typically the EU standard. And by complying with the stringent standards, these companies ensure access to the other markets as well. And that is the core of why EU is able to exert this leverage.
You call it the de facto Brussels effect or something like that, and you distinguish this from something else that you call it the de jure Brussels effect. What exactly do you mean by this kind of differentiation?
Yeah, it is a terminology that we lawyers like a lot to distinguish between de facto and de jure, but let me spell it out also for the non-lawyers why it's significant.
Exactly.
So de facto refers to this idea that the EU regulates the single market, and it's the global companies that adjust their business behavior. And if Facebook does something globally, it doesn't mean that the United States government would have changed its rules. It doesn't require any regulatory adjustment by foreign governments. It's just de facto. It happens on the marketplace. So the companies are following the EU rules irrespective what the rules of their home governments are. De jure refers to the step further when then foreign companies also start adjusting their regulations and follow Brussels' example. So we, for instance, see both happen in data privacy. So companies, like we discussed, are adopting the GDPR as their global benchmark. But then, for instance, Mark Zuckerberg was lobbying the US government to adopt a federal privacy law in the US that would be modeled after the GDPR. Right. The US hasn't gone there yet, but we have 120 countries around the world that now have a data protection law, and most of them follow very closely the general data protection regulation. So that is the other step that we see, that we actually see the governments also chasing their behavior.
I mean, can I ask you a bit of a heretic question on this GDPR? Because, of course, everybody in Brussels loves it and thinks it has been a great achievement. But what you just described is, of course, a big American company thinking it's a great standard and wanting to have it. And so this company, in a sense, is benefiting from this global GDPR, from the European GDPR. But many smaller European companies actually see this mostly as a burden and think that they don't benefit from this regulation. So is this in the end something that this regulation power that the EU has imposed here on companies, is it the power that in the end helps the big companies that are mostly American and Chinese by now and is not helping European companies?
So I do share the concern that you expressed there. So I think it is certainly not the intention of the European Union. If you look at the ways that the EU is trying to curtail the anti-competitive practices of these big tech companies, EU wants to make sure that also small players can compete on the marketplace. But it is true that the EU regulations often does require quite extensive compliance requirements, and they are easier to meet if you are a big, powerful company. So there can be an unintended distributional effect, whereby the small players find it more burdensome to comply with the EU regulations.
I would like to turn to Ashoka, because he has been listening to us from the morning mist of Princeton. I can see it from our video link. I would like to ask his opinion about what Anu just told us about Brussels effect and the possibility of considering Europe as a superpower.
So my questions are all related, but they from the question that Guntram just asked is, let's stipulate that Professor Bradford has outlined a very convincing argument in her book. So I buy that. The question for me now as an economist is, so what economic benefits does it create? Not just for the European companies, but also for the European consumer. In other words, yes, this achievement is meaningful, and what is Europe therefore giving in terms of the material interest of Europeans?
Great. I think it is a very good question. And the most concrete material benefit is that by setting the rules for the EU market, the EU can level the playing field and protecting the competitiveness of the European industry when they are facing competition in Europe. But if the Brussels effect also changes the rules in export market, then the EU's companies' competitiveness is protected there as well. So that is, I think, the most concrete economic benefit. Then there are other benefits if you think about EU's environmental law. Most of those goals are not accomplished if we only see an adjustment of behavior in the European market. And even European consumers that hold strong preferences about fighting climate change and promoting more sustainable goals in general, they also have an incidental benefit of seeing some of these regulations penetrate the global marketplace.
I would like to
sorry, on the material benefits, just the leveling of the playing field, I understand. That argument is a good argument. And I completely agree with you. But the question that I think Guntram was asking, and that's the one that we really need to answer, is does it increase in some sense the dynamism of the companies? Does it help the consumer in terms of lower costs? I understand your statement that the consumer values environmental protection, and therefore these laws or regulations conform to those standards and preferences. But I'm not able to see in this that European companies have become more competitive, or that the consumer is benefiting in some direct way that is tangible.
So I think there are many who would share your skepticism or the fear that regulation is an impediment to innovation. And the regulation cuts into the ability of the European companies to compete. And if you look at, there is no European Google, there is no European social network site comparable to Facebook. So I think we do need to ask the question of what is the relationship between regulation and innovation and competitiveness. But at the same time, I don't think it is always a right to assume that more regulation leads to less competitive markets. Right. We have very heavily regulated Northern European markets that are actually very competitive. There's a fantastic book by a French economist at NYU, New York University, Thomas Philippon, with a fantastic book called The Great Reversal, How America Gave Up on Free Markets, that shows that the lack of competition regulation in the US has increased the market concentration to the extent that the prices have gone up for the consumers and the profits up obviously for the companies. But that speaks for the healthier regulatory approach that Europe has pursued in this regard. And I think environmental area, we have many examples where the energy efficient technologies not only deliver an environmental benefit, but can also lead to productivity gains and greater innovation.
I would just like to expand a bit on this argument of Thomas Philippon, which is really a fantastic book to read, the great reversal, how America gave up on free markets. I mean, I think one key point here is not just the regulation, but it's really the enforcement power of the EU. So the EU has a centralized competition authority, and that centralized competition authority actually has enforcement power and is therefore capable of enforcing the rules and making sure that these rules actually are complied with, and therefore consumers benefit. And I think Thomas estimates that the benefit for a median household is something like $500 compared to the US. So it's very significant material. The fact that we have tougher competition policy enforcement in Europe for consumers than in the US. So I think this enforcement issue is really one of the key issues. And I guess if I was to worry about one thing in your book is, yes, there's the regulation side, but then how strong can we be on the enforcement really? And I'm not thinking now of competition, I'm thinking of artificial intelligence, for example. We had a big debate here with the Google CEO, Sundar Pichai, who said we need more regulation of AI, but who's going to enforce it? I mean, who's going to enforce that regulation in the AI space? Do we have the capacities at the European level to do so?
Yeah, so I think enforcement is absolutely central. And when I describe the conditions under which the Brussels effect occurs, it starts from the big market size. But that's not enough. You need to have the regulatory institutions to leverage that market size and translate it into tangible regulatory influence. So I take institutions and enforcement capacity very seriously. And there are three different ways in general how the EU enforces some of these regulations that the book discusses. So competition is an example where a lot of the enforcement, even though it does take place at the national member state level, the Commission is very powerful and the Commission does go after big companies taking big cases. The GDPR has delegated the enforcement to national member state agencies. And we see some rather active enforcement coming out of those member state agencies. But I think the jury is still out how effective it will be. And the effectiveness of the GDPR will ultimately depend on those agencies being able to enforce it. The third model is what the EU has thus far followed in its regulation of hate speech online, where it has signed a voluntary code of conduct with these big tech companies that actually have the comparative advantage in developing technologies that can automate, they can detect the hate speech in their platforms. That would be very difficult for the EU institutions, for instance, to directly enforce. So I think the key is also that the EU can select the right way and an effective way to enforce these regulations. That's the only way to deter and have the changes in the market behavior that the EU is trying to accomplish.
I would like to take a question from the audience.
So you keep the mic, okay. So my name is Zaki Laidi. I'm currently special advisor to the HRVP, but formerly a professor from Sciences Po. I absolutely share your analysis. I've worked on the same topic, and basically I came to the same conclusion.
And I cite you in the book. I love your work. It's
you.
wonderful to have you here.
So when you actually, the question was, is the EU a superpower? As such, the question doesn't mean nothing. I mean, it means nothing. It's not the EU as a global superpower. It's the EU as a regulatory superpower. And that's the sense of your, I mean, I read your article, not your book. But I think that we do share the same views. And the strongest point you made concerns the fact that the EU has a market power, has a regulatory power, and a capacity to enforce, as Guntram said. Now, I wonder whether your analysis and mine are not from the past and not applicable to the future. Because in all cases you've mentioned and on which we also worked, the EU was the prime mover. And it's no more the case. So you may have a big market power, but you have now big other markets, like the Chinese one, for example. So they can also try to be the markets, the norm setters. So the question of the prime mover is absolutely crucial for the EU if it wants to remain at the forefront of the as a regulatory power. And the second thing, and it's amazing because I read this morning an interview made by the Commission, the French Commissioner Breton, and precisely he wants to come back on what was the European priority, the consumer, the role of the consumer and the interests of the consumer. And obviously, since we are facing now, for example, the Chinese, there is a strong question here in Europe whether we didn't push too far the interest of the consumer. So that's the two questions I wanted to address.
So it's one of the questions that I take on in the book of whether the Beijing effect will take over the Brussels effect sometime soon. So no matter which statistics you look at, it is inevitable fact that the EU's relative size of the global GDP will go down. And the entire thesis of Brussels effect is premised on the idea that you have big enough of a market that it is unavoidable for global companies. So the more the other markets grow, the more opportunities of trading outside of the EU grow. And there might be a point where a company concludes that, look, the regulations are too costly, I will look for opportunities elsewhere. I doubt, though, that alternative standard is emerging from China or anywhere else anytime soon. China may be making inroads into some areas of regulation, but the kind of wholesale ability to regulate sector of another that the Brussels is able to do is unlikely to emerge from China anytime soon. So if you think about the argument that I make in the book, not that the EU's sort of relative economic size wouldn't decline, but that its regulatory power will outlive its, to some extent, it will last longer than its economic might purely measured by the GDPR. And that is because the GDP per capita is a much better predictor of the country's willingness to regulate. There will be a while before the Chinese consumers reach the level of wealth that they are asking for as extensive protections as the EU consumers are asking for.
Well, they will not be allowed anyway.
Yes, and then the idea too that by the time the Chinese would develop that demand, most likely the overall GDP growth has declined to the extent, the rate of it, that the government may have second thoughts of imposing costly regulations that may take a further toll on that regulation. And if I may say the final point, to the extent China is building that regulatory capacity today, it is actively importing a lot of regulatory models from the EU. So what we may be seeing one day is the Beijing effect indirectly further exporting the rules that were initially imported from here.
I mean, can I push you on one point a little bit further? So, because I thought that was a very inspiring point by Zaki. I mean, really, this question also of sectoral advantages. I mean, the EU has been strong as a regulatory power on machines, on traditional instruments, and okay, we are starting to do something on the data. But on some key technologies, we don't even master them anymore. I mean, artificial intelligence, it's the probably one of the most important technologies in the next 20 years. We are way behind China and way behind the US. So we lack the investment. We lack the firms that do this. And can we actually still remain a relevant regulatory power if we don't master these technologies? Because China does. I mean, China is a leader in AI.
I think it's both fascinating and important question, and I think something that all of us now need to understand after the Commission unveiled its white paper on artificial intelligence and clearly articulated the intention to get into that space. So the EU has been able to be a regulator in this sphere in terms of privacy without having those big data companies in the EU. What may be somewhat different, though, and I have a hard time now predicting exactly the extent to which the Brussels effect would be applicable to the AI. There may be so many different applications of AI that somewhere it happens, somewhere it will not. But it is a new area, and I understand why the EU wants to move in fast, because China is indeed investing massively into this area. But also the Chinese approach to regulating this area is very different from the way Europe wants this regulation to emerge. So this kind of digital authoritarianism, where facial recognition technique, for instance, is used as to advance state surveillance and significantly curtail individual liberties. It is very difficult for the EU to see the world where that would be the norm. And EU is concerned if you look at China's quite successful attempts to export these technologies, and there are many authoritarian governments who see this as a helpful enforcement tool. But if you also think about the alternative model, is this US techno-libertarianism that also has shown its limits in many areas where we've seen violations of data privacy, for instance. So I understand the EU's urge to move, and EU, but I think it's a somewhat different question if EU can successfully set the rules for the game than if the EU can be a player. If it's just the referee or if it's also the player, regulation is not enough. But the EU at least will know that if it can set the rules, the game is not rigged against the European companies. And the European companies, if the EU has the environment to develop and those companies, the EU can succeed.
Can I ask one question to Ashoka? Yes. Ashoka, since you are still with us, I wondered whether you would like to say a few words about the country of your country of origin, which is India. I mean, India is, in a sense, very much looking also at what kind of regulation to adopt in the internet and in the digital space. My understanding is there's a big debate in India on this, and I'm just wondering whether you can say a few words about, which pole is actually more attractive from an Indian point of view. I mean, is there an attraction to follow a more liberal, democratic way in terms of regulating privacy and so on in the internet in India, or is there temptation to perhaps pursue a more Chinese way?
So, Gundram, you give me more credit than I deserve. I don't follow the Indian debate as closely as your question warrants. But what I would say is, I think I would stipulate that Professor Bradford's thesis would apply in this context, which is that Indians will quietly, in the end, do what the world standard is on this particular issue. Can I just ask a slightly different question? Is this a good moment?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. So the word superpower, which is there was a qualification to that in the comment just made, which is regulatory superpower. And I think that statement is pretty much uncontested at this point. What I think that statement is that the EU aspires to be a superpower in a broader dimension on strategic issues, on foreign policy issues, on monetary issues, and there the experience is so vastly different. And the two-part question so vastly different. Why the difference? And in your perspective, the two-part question on the technocratic side, as you say, in a quiet way, the technocrats are able to. On the technocratic side, as you say, in a quiet way, the technocrats are able to, in a sense, that does not apply on the broader. Does not
has been a power that has been very much under the radar. It has not been politicized. There has not been a backlash. It has been the EU regulating its single market, and few have questioned its sovereign right to do so. And the EU cannot really be even effectively accused, even though some try to do that, of regulatory imperialism, when it is the decision of private companies to extend the EU law across their global operations. So I think partially the logic, the harnessing the market forces and the global companies' self-interest has allowed the EU to be so effective. And the logic is very different in areas that you mentioned. So if you think about, for instance, financial sanctions, something that we touched early on, that requires a very robust Eurozone architecture and the kind of instruments that the EU is not rivaling the United States. And I think now we all talk about the manifested decision to try to become a geopolitical commission with very big goals in that regard. And I think we need to be cautious in a couple of ways. So first of all, the Brussels effect certainly should not introduce complacency, meaning that the EU would not be pursuing its goals in areas where the markets are not doing the work for the EU. The Brussels effect will do nothing to solve Iran, North Korea, the threat of Russia, the migration crisis. There's work to be done. And the second, I think to the extent we would try to leverage the Brussels effect to geopolitical goals, it might be ill-suited for those. There may be some intersections where the regulatory issues touch on geopolitical interest of the EU, but the wholesale application of the tool that is in its essence a regulatory power is not the same as trying to pursue some of the goals where it is really not the global companies that are transmitting the interest of the EU.
I mean, on this point, I think it's a very, and we should see whether there are other questions
Yeah,
in the
there's
audience.
one other question from the audience, which I marked from before.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
Good afternoon. If the European Union is a superpower or world power, should we be considered about the lack of a public sphere here in Brussels? It seems to be that democracy operates at a national level, and that means that the technocrats in Brussels are free to make all these regulations, basically with only the scrutiny of other experts in Brussels. And does that make the Brussels effect stronger, or should we be worried about that lack of accountability, that lack of democratic accountability?
Yeah, so that certainly is has been a serious discussion for a while, the democratic deficit and the extent to which the policies emanating from these institutions reflect the preferences of the citizens. And I think the book doesn't delve directly into the question of whether there is a sufficient degree of democracy. In many ways, though, and this is something that if we compare to many other regimes, the civil society, if you consider them as representative of the public view, has had a lot of influence in these regulations. And there's a lot of research suggesting that, for instance, corporations have not taken over the regulatory process the way they have taken over in the United States. And many of these powerful regulations were vehemently opposed initially by business interests, whether it's the chemical regulation REACH or whether it's the GDPR. But even though there was attempts to lobby, these regulations came out of the legislative process relatively unscratched. So it shows that there's still an influential civil society that has a voice in the regulatory process. I think here the question is whether it should be even stronger. What is the best way to participate? And that is, I think, a little bit sort of beyond where we go in there. But I'm grateful that you raised that, because I think it is still something that you need to have a legitimate structure in order to defend the power that you are projecting outside. I think one question is whether foreign citizens should have more of a say if these regulations actually apply to foreign citizens as well. And one criticism is that is the Brussels effect compromising the political autonomy of citizens outside of the EU that has no even indirect ability to influence what is coming out of the EU. And that is sort of a longer conversation that I think there is not a single answer. I think in some instances it is true that the European consumers' preferences do get transplanted into markets where the consumers may not make the same trade-offs. But at the same time, there are instances of foreign consumers finding that their own governments fail to regulate at the optimal level. They don't have the regulatory institutions to protect the environment or the food safety of their citizens. And sometimes they are direct beneficiaries if the EU, for instance, goes after a global cartel and manages to dismantle the cartel. That then also affects the prices of consumers in other markets. So there is no short answer, but I think it is a very critical question.
But if I may follow up on that question of the democracy and the lack of public big debate, maybe another angle to look at this is emotional kind of angle. Like, are technocracies emotionally sustainable? You know, like what is the attachment that the people might have to the demands of somehow almost like the romantic demands that one might have towards the people that lead the way or stuff like that. I mean, if I might provoke a little bit with that question, your reaction.
Yes, I don't know how emotional relationship the citizens in Europe would have to the regulatory rulemaking in Brussels, but ultimately I think the citizens will judge these institutions based on the output of whether they manage to pass regulations that serve the public interest. And I think in many ways there has been there's an explanation why the EU has been so extensively and successfully passing on regulations when the other governments have not, is that in many instances these regulations, they always have a dual goal. They are serving the environmental goal or the food safety goal or advancing the privacy rights of an individual. Plus, they are building the single market. There's the economic goal also of facilitating trade because the integration has been done and pursued through regulation. So there has been a way to engage broader segments of the society and align the business interests with the interest of consumer advocates, for instance, who prefer higher environmental standards or higher standards when it comes to data privacy. So there is a logic of European rulemaking that is quite unique because of this dual goal. Whether it's emotional, in the end, I think there's differences still in how the consumers perceive how successful the EU regulations ultimately are.
I have another question from the audience and two questions from the audience, which I will take them on the same time because then we are going to wrap up soon.
All right.
Hi, my name is Carl van der Malen. I do my PhD research at Ghent University on codes of conduct under the GDPR. And so my question is, how does soft law factor in with the Brussels effect? Do non-binding standards and guidelines have the same territorial impact outside the EU as, for example, normal directives and regulations do? And maybe related to that, under the GDPR, these codes of conduct, do they amplify the effects of the GDPR or perhaps weaken it or so? Thank you.
And the second question over there.
Stasinopoulos, formally with the European Commission. Thank you very much, actually. There is no doubt that your argument is very convincing as far as some policy areas in which the European Union was able to set the rules, the standards, and therefore shape the global business environment. And we know the cases, the sectors. But I think it was mentioned, the technology sector, with the digitalization, which is proceeding very fast. And I'd like to touch one aspect, and correct me if I'm wrong. You feel the European Union did that unilaterally, without even consulting often other, and finally managed to influence the business. But that aspect of unilateral, how plausible is in a sector like technology, like 5G? It seems to me the only workable approach would be the European Union to sit down from the beginning with China and jointly prepare. So I see your argument in some areas. There's some limitations, okay. But again, I would like to say, certainly I'm 100% with you that unilaterally the community shaped even business global environment.
Great. So first, on the question of soft law, I think the Brussels effect book makes it very clear that unilateralism, and this ties on your question as well, is only one of the many tools of influence. And often there are complementary ways that the EU can leverage, whether it's formal trade agreements, non-binding standards, various guidance, technocratic assistance in building capacity in foreign regulatory agencies, all can contribute towards the same goal. And I think to take on your question specifically, the EU is not a committed unilateralist. Quite the contrary. I think, if anything, EU is a contingent unilateralist. It is very natural for the EU to pursue multilateral cooperation when that cooperation is forthcoming. So the EU, it is part of the ethos of the EU. That's how it's in the DNA to work with other partners. And there's nothing that would suggest that the EU would rather set the standards alone. But especially now today, when the multilateralism is really in crisis and international institutions are in retreat, and it is hard to count on President Trump leading America with the EU in the global fight against climate change. It is very hard to count that the Chinese would share some of the preferences of the Europeans when it comes to artificial intelligence. The EU has been acting alone when it has been too difficult to cooperate multilaterally. But there are also instances where this EU's unilateralism can get the others on the negotiation table, and when the countries have the incentive to set the standards jointly with the EU. And I wholeheartedly agree with you that there are many areas, for instance, where we could pursue transatlantic cooperation when it comes to regulation of AI, some of the areas where the preferences are not so entrenched that there could be complementarities and common interests, especially when we describe and discussed earlier the Chinese way to approach surveillance in the AI scheme. That is something where I think the Europeans and Americans are actually quite close. And I certainly wouldn't say that there are many areas where we can work together with Chinese when the interests are aligned. And that is not something that the book would advocate, that we should forget those or we should prioritize the Brussels effect. But often, when those avenues are not successful, it is the Brussels effect that fills the void.
Thank you very much. I would like to give 1 minute to Ashoka before we are going to leave and close for some last reflections from your side of the world.
Thank you very much. Look, I think that Professor Bradford has made the most convincing case that I have heard for the EU as a benign force, convincing case and for the global economy. The EU as a for benign itself, force. I'm left with one lingering question for the global economy. Giuseppe and the young man for itself, I'm left is question which EU's ultimate success, and the young man who asked the question before to forge a European identity. The EU's ultimate success, because it is not a nation state, it relies to forge a European identity, a sense of identity, because it is not transcends national borders. It relies, and the question has to be a sense of identity. This regulatory success, if it has to have true meaning, and the question has to be: do you think that it has contributed in any way regulatory success to creating if it has to have sense of Europeanness? Do you think that it has
I think it's a big question for us to
creating
take in the
a
end,
stronger?
but a very intriguing one. I probably wouldn't go as far as to say that the Brussels effect has cultivated a sense of identity, but I think it may have cultivated a sense of self-assurance and success, and a kind of shared understanding that these institutions matter. They can provide very tangible payoffs for consumers in areas that consumers care about. And there's something very concrete for these institutions to point to the consumers so that we are serving their interest in the way that I think you can take a shared success, a shared joy of the success and those goals. Again, I don't think there is a unanimity that all these regulations has served equally well every European, and everybody would be as proud of those their achievements. But I think given what else is going on and how much we have criticized and highlighted the failures of the institutions, I think there is a positive narrative of the EU being a meaningful actor that has the capacity to influence outcomes in the world. And I hope that does give a certain sense of purpose to the project and the idea that there are goals that are meaningful and something that the individuals can truly benefit from.
That's a very beautiful answer. I accept that answer.
So Anu, I was, I have to say, skeptical at the beginning about the book, also because I thought you would preach to the converted here in Brussels. Of course, we saw that at the beginning, not everybody was convinced. We should probably do
I'm waiting for
see how everybody
again, yes.
thinks about it. Yeah. But you converted Ashoka Modi, which is quite something on a specific point on the EU, that the EU actually delivers some benefits. I guess the one question I have is really coming back to the more geopolitical question that Zaki Laidi also raised. And that relates also to the democracy question. I mean, so if we were to use Europe's regulatory power to pursue more geopolitical goals, do we actually have the consensus to do this? Do we actually have the capacity to do it? And do we have the political consensus and the legitimacy to do this? I think this is, for me, one of the most fundamental questions, because we do have the power, we have the competition power, we have the trade power, we have the regulatory power, and the big debate is now to what extent we can use those powers in the bigger geopolitical game where we have to compete with Chinese firms that have different market conditions, where Americans withdraw from multilateralism. As soon as we use this regulatory power for these kind of purposes, will we still have the legitimacy and the unity in the EU to actually do it?
So if the trade agreements are any guidance on what might to expect, the trade agreements today are very much about regulatory standards, and they've been very contentious. And they have become very politicized, and that's where we have lacked the kind of shared purpose that whatever we're trying to accomplish through these trade agreements uniformly would be advancing the European welfare. So I think there is a risk when you politicize an instrument that has worked well because it has not been elevated to that level. What also gives me some concern that if you start enmeshing some geopolitical goals, for instance, industrial policy goals, and blend them into one of the well-tested fields like competition policy, you might be risking undermining the instrument that has worked well when it has been free of those constraints. And here I'm referring, for instance, the calls by France and Germany to rewrite the competition rules in the way that we would be creating the possibility for European national champions. And if you take any advice from how the Brussels effect would predict that to happen, is that the EU has been very successful in exporting its competition laws. What would prevent from those more protectionist industrial policy considerations also to be exported and adopted by many of the countries that now look to Europe for guidance? What would then prevent from the French Competition Authority from blocking an attempt by a German company to acquire a French company because they want to build French national champions? So in many ways, I think you need to be cautious when you are redeploying a tool and deviating from its initial purpose that has actually proved to be quite robust and serving the interests that are quite widely shared.
So, let's ask the audience again. Do you think the EU is a superpower?
We'll ask a regulatory superpower.
It's sensibly more people than at the beginning of the
you.
session. So
Thank
thank you
you.
very much, Anu. You did a good job. And thank you so much, Ashoka, for joining us, and to Guntram and to all of you for this first experiment of the Sounds of Economics Live. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Thanks for listening to The Sound of Economics. If you are interested in more Bruegel work, you can check out our blogs, other podcasts, publications, and you name it, on our website, www.bruegel.org. We hope you join us again for The Sound of Economics. See you next time. Bye-bye.